Welcome back to Nature's Corner. My name is Erin Shaw. I'm a naturalist with Ohio Department of Natural Resources. On today's show, we're going to be talking about how animals survive the winter. And we have Lynn Johnson on our show today. So Lynn has been with us a couple months, a year?
Almost a year now.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I started taking the OCVN class, that's Ohio Certified Volunteer Naturalist, last January a year ago, and was certified in March. Although I've been a volunteer naturalist for a long time prior to taking the certification class. And I've also been an electrical engineer. So if I get real technical after a while, you'll understand where that came from.
We're glad you're here, Lynn, and I've learned a lot from you in the recent past. So here we are in the winter time. I actually really enjoy the winter for a short time. I love the snow. I even like when it really freezes hard, you know, you go out and it looks like crystals and everything. And but, you know, I've got my winter boots, my winter coat.
And you can't use your kayak.
Yeah, just sit there. So how do animals survive the winter?
Well, animals have several different strategies for surviving the winter, Erin. The really important thing to remember is that life is all about energy. To be alive, something has to get some energy, it has to do something with it, and what it does is two things. It uses it to grow and to get more energy, and to reproduce. So all of life is about energy, and so in the wintertime, energy is less available because temperature is a measure of how much energy is available at any given time. Now, most animals and plants can't use thermal energy or heat energy directly. They get their energy from food or in case of plants, from sunlight. But if there's less energy out there, it is more of a challenge for them. So I like to think of the way animals respond to cold weather in terms of what they have to do to get energy. So they can either do one of three things. They can go where there's more energy, like where it's warm. They can somehow acquire more energy where they are, which means more food in general. Or they can do something that allows them to use less energy. And we're going to talk about each of those options here as we go along.
Okay, so how do they get more energy?
Well, probably the most common way for an animal to get more energy is to store it up ahead of time. There's obviously not a lot of things growing in the wintertime, but there are still nuts and berries out there on some of the trees and bushes. Animals like beavers will take branches, because they eat the bark, and store them underwater in their ponds, so if the pond freezes over, they can still get to those branches to have bark. And of course, there's the squirrels that stores food. This little cartoon was in the paper the other day. It's the Mutts cartoon, and in this cartoon there's two squirrels that live up in this tree, and they love to throw acorns at the animals and people down below them. But this says, "We prudently gathered all autumn to survive the cold deprivation of a brutal winter." And in the middle frame, there's a little dog down on the ground getting bonked with a acorn, and in the last frame, the squirrel says, "Oh, it pays to plan for the future." So storing up energy is one of the options that they have.
You know, something interesting I learned about squirrels is that they're one of the main gardeners, I guess. They plant a lot of trees because they bury all the acorns and the nuts, and then they often forget where they plant
That's
them.
right. I've got a couple of walnut trees in my yard that, well, they're usually in the flower beds because that's where the squirrels find it easiest to bury the nest. But you dig down in there, and there's a walnut there that some squirrel buried the year before and then didn't come back to get over the winter. So.
That's cool. So what a neat adaptation, or I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I'm not sure that would be considered an adaptation, but it's certainly a trait or a characteristic that they use to store up the energy that they're going to need for the fall.
Yeah, because squirrels plant the trees, and then the trees grow, and they have more nuts for the squirrels. So interesting. So they store up food.
Okay. Yes. The storing of food is one thing. the other thing I mentioned was that they can go someplace where they don't need to have as much energy or it's not as hard to get. So this is the obvious one, the birds that fly south for the winter. Now which birds fly? Not all the birds fly south because there's lots of birds out there right now. But birds like hummingbirds, they eat nectar. Nectar comes from blooming flowers. There aren't any flowers. Well, yes, I did see a dandelion the other day. So there are flowers blooming out there, but not ones that the hummingbirds could survive on. So they have to fly south. A lot of the insect-eating birds, like red-winged blackbirds and killdeer, fly south for the winter. You notice I didn't mention robins, because robins do tend to migrate, but we always have robins here year-round because some of the ones we have here probably came down from Canada. And they don't eat worms in the wintertime, but they do eat berries.
So why don't all animals go south in the winter?
Very good question, Erin. I know you went south for the winter this year.
I love going south in the winter.
Well, think about it. We're going to talk about this turtle here after a while, but if he started going south back in August, he'd still be in Caesar Creek State Park by now and would have had a real problem with that. And we'll talk more about that turtle later on in the program. But for many animals, they're too slow, or there's a lot of dangers in traveling. They don't know what they're going to find along the way. Are they going to find shelter? Are they going to find food along the way? It takes a lot of energy to travel, so they have to be able to build up that energy beforehand. The hummingbird that I mentioned earlier, they can lose a third to a half of their body weight while they migrate.
Isn't it amazing? Those tiny little animals
yes.
can fly that far. Incredible. Yeah. Okay, so how can animals use less energy?
Okay, that's where a lot of the fun stuff starts happening. We think typically of hibernation in animals. And hibernation, of course, here's our black bear skin. We don't have a whole black bear here today. For one thing, he would be hibernating if there was one around. And second, as far as we know, we don't have any resident population of black bears in Caesar Creek State Park or even southwestern Ohio. But bears are sort of the classical hibernator. Hibernation is a way that animals can use less energy. And we're going to talk about a lot of other ways that they can use less energy. But basically it means doing less, being less active. In the case of hibernators and some of the other kinds of things, their body temperature drops down. But another thing that for animals that don't hibernate is they can just get together with a bunch of their close friends and keep each other warm. Some of the small songbirds like chickadees will do that. On real cold days like the one they're predicting for tonight and tomorrow, the chickadees may cluster together maybe in a hollow log or something, and a bunch of them will get together and they'll keep each other warm, because a large object like a ball full of chickadees has less surface area for the amount of volume that it has. There's the engineer coming back again. And so they can keep each other warm. The ones on the outside will get cold, but then they'll move around and be on the inside, and the ones on that were nice and warm on the inside will move outside and take turns. But I'm not sure they actually do that, but they probably do.
I think penguins do that.
Yes, I believe penguins do that also. So keeping each other warm is another strategy that the animals can have to deal with cold weather.
How about insulation? I put on a little extra insulation.
Insulation, yeah, well, that's one thing that the bear does. And that's probably a place where we can move on to this. Let me move just to these right here, because here's an example of something that is insulation but not insulation. This is a goldenrod plant. You see these blooming with their bright yellow flowers in August and September out in any open grassy area, especially in prairies. But what I'm particularly interested in here today is this little bump on this thing. We call this a gall. That's G-A-L-L, and that results from an insect laying its egg up here in the bud of this thing, and then when the insect egg hatches out, it becomes a larva or a small worm, crawls down in there chewing its way along, finds a nice place there and starts chewing on that thing. And this is the plant's response to that. Might think of this like a mosquito bite. When a mosquito bites you, right around that. If you scratch it a little bit, you get a little bump there. In case of humans, that bump goes away in a little while. In the case of the plant, the outer shell of this plant grew around that and provides a place in there for the insect to live. Now, the plant didn't really want that insect in there. That insect is chewing on it, but the plant still survived just fine. It still made flowers and made seeds up here. So these two, this plant and this animal, have learned to get along quite well together, excuse me. We call this the goldenrod gall fly, is the insect that does that. And we have a picture here of this, and this is one of the pictures that there's a close-up available to the cameraman. And the gall looks something like this, opened up, and has this little larva inside there. I'm not going to open this one up. We could. I could cut this open. We could see that in there. But this animal survives in there. And a little bit later on in the program, when we talk about some of the other characteristics of this, I'll go into a little more detail. But the way I can tell he's still in there is that there's no hole in this. If I look all around there, it's nice and smooth. If there was a hole in here, that would, depending on the size and shape of the hole, it would tell me one of two things. Either the insect had survived the winter and crawled out, and it's too early in the year for that. And he makes a little round hole. I don't know if you can get a picture of this one or not. This one doesn't have the hole on it, but there's a little black dot there that I made with a magic marker, right where my finger is pointing. That's about the size and shape of the hole that the insect would bore out of there when he climbs out in the springtime. Now, the other thing can happen, the other kind of hole, is sometimes you'll find a hole that's about the size and shape of the point of this pencil. So, like somebody made a cone-shaped hole in there. And in that case, one of the birds that did not fly south for the winter, the downy woodpecker, our smallest woodpecker, comes along, he punches a hole about the size of that pencil point in there, gets that grub out of there, and has a midwinter snack. So in the springtime, you can look at these plants and say, did the insect survive? Did a woodpecker eat it? Or, and if you find one like this that doesn't have a hole in it at all, maybe the insect didn't survive. But I'm going to take these back and put them where I found them and let the insects take their chances out with the woodpeckers and the cold weather. So, but this is a form of insulation, but this doesn't insulate it very much. Nice thick fur, lots of fat. Those are good insulators. Goldenrod gall, not such a good insulator. So,
being insulated, does that help or hurt the animal that's in there?
Well, generally it's going to help. Insulation slows the rate at which heat moves in, or the heat energy moves in or out of something. So if there's more insulation there, any energy that that animal has inside there is going to leave more slowly. A large animal like a bear can have enough insulation to keep it from freezing over the winter. Even a smaller animal like a chipmunk. Although the chipmunk doesn't store up its energy in fat, it stores up energy in seeds that it's kept in its burrow, and it'll wake up several times during the winter and eat more. But insulation can help. Snow provides insulation. Lots of insects live in the ground or right near the surface of the ground, but covered with snow. That helps protect them. Even litter, like in that turtle's cage over here, which we'll talk about in a little bit later, even that little bit of decaying leaves and things like that can buffer the temperatures so that they're not as cold in the ground as they would be on the surface.
So when you put those back, is it better for them to be like insulated, or?
Well, this is a good point. There's been some studies done, including one or several studies done by biologists at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, where I used to work, that studied this particular insect. And one of the studies they did was exactly that question. Is it better to keep that thing standing up, or if they fall down and get covered by the snow? And it turns out that for this particular insect, standing up all winter is better than laying down and being covered by snow. When it's covered by the snow, it's actually warmer, but it uses more energy because it's warmer and tends not to survive as well. They can survive in either way, but the ones that stayed in an upright plant all winter tend to do better than the ones that were in plants that fell down or got knocked down over the winter.
Makes sense. That's why you shouldn't bring a praying mantis egg case in, by the way.
Yeah, and I kept these in my garage after I collected them so that they wouldn't get too warm. If I'd had them inside the house, the insect might have decided to crawl out and he wouldn't have found any more goldenrod to chew on inside my house. So.
Exactly, and I don't know how many praying mantis are in a little egg case, but it seems like there's thousands, because I did that once. You come in and they're everywhere. So what else? It's a slow of heat and energy exchange.
Insulation slows the rate at which heat can move in and out of things.
Other animals might be bats and...
Yeah, bats, again, are warm-blooded animals. They are among the true hibernators. Their body temperature will drop down. So that when the insulation and heat flow is related to the difference in the temperature between, say, the inside of the body and the air temperature or the ground temperature around it. So if the body temperature is lower, it'll lose less energy. And so bats reduce their body temperatures while they're hibernating. Plus they also cluster close together, so they're keeping each other warm. But you know, we've heard a lot about the white nose syndrome in bats. That it's a fungus disease that gets into the bats, and when they get it, their noses turn white from the fungus growing there. Just like any disease, your body tends to use more energy. That's why you get a fever. Your body's using more energy to fight that disease. If the bats get that disease while they're hibernating, their bodies will be using more energy than they would if they were hibernating while they're healthy. So the bats tend to wake up in the middle of the winter hungry because they've used up all their stored energy. But what do bats eat? They eat insects. How many insects are flying around in the middle of the winter? Not very many. So the bats starve to death. This is why the white nose syndrome is so deadly to the bats, because they don't have the energy to survive the infection over the winter. Plus, because they cluster together, it's just like any other infectious disease. If they're all close to each other, they pass it around and everybody gets it. So we have a lot of loss of bats because of the fact that this disease affects them when they can't fight back when they're hibernating.
Yeah, makes sense. It also makes sense that once you stay cold, you use less energy, you know, for that warm up and thaw. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, like I said, some of the animals, like the chipmunks, do actually wake up during their hibernation and eat a little bit. They may not come out of their dens because they've stored food down in the underground there, and then they'll go back into hibernation for a while. So hibernation, it turns out, can last for a few days, weeks, or months, depending on the particular type of animal and the size of the animal. A smaller animal, like a chipmunk, can't store up as much energy and fat, so it has to wake up during the winter and eat something.
So you've used the word hibernation a couple times. What does that mean? And if the animal is not a true hibernator, what are...
Okay, hibernation applies to warm-blooded animals. And there's only two kinds of warm-blooded animals. The mammals, that's animals with fur, like us and bears. Bears can hibernate, we can't. And birds. And I don't know of any bird that is considered to be a true hibernator. Now, I won't say that there aren't any, because as soon as you do that, somebody will say, oh, there is this one little bird someplace that does. But anyway, in a warm-blooded animal by definition keeps its body temperature at a constant rate. That's why when we get sick, you check your body temperature, and if it's not 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, then somebody thinks you've got a fever, and they start looking to see what kind of a disease you have. That constant temperature isn't really quite constant. It always fluctuates up and down a little bit, but that constant temperature is what we call regulation or thermoregulation. And in hibernation, a hibernating animal suppresses their body temperature, lowers their body temperature, and the way they do that is by changing how fast their body's using energy. Like I said, it keeps coming back to energy. The big word the scientists use is metabolism. Metabolism basically is talking about how you take the energy that's in food and convert it to useful energy, either in terms of warm body or muscular activity or brain activity or whatever. That's metabolism. A true hibernator is able to suppress that metabolism, which has the effect of lowering the body temperature. So when we talk about other animals like the gall fly, which is not a mammal or a bird, then we have to use a different word. And you ready to go on to that?
Sure.
Okay. Stole her thunder there.
No.
Anyway, in the case of cold-blooded animals, they can't regulate their body temperature. So their body temperature tends to move up and down with the temperatures of their surroundings. So a gall fly out there tonight, when the temperature is going to go down to 11 degrees, is going to be very cold, probably very close to 11 degrees by morning, because that animal has no way to regulate its temperature. So in cold-blooded animals, the process that's comparable to hibernation is called brumation. That's B-R-U-M-A-T-I-O-N. And did anybody ever hear of that who wasn't a scientist? Probably not. I hadn't heard about it until a few weeks ago myself. I knew that cold-blooded animals did something, I just didn't know what they called it. The difference is that their metabolism slows down, but it's not through an active suppression of that by the animal's activities. It's driven by the temperature externally. However, the animals do become less active. They do use less energy, and they survive the winter.
So our turtles and stuff kind of slow down during the winter too. I guess it's slightly cooler in here because of just overall temperature, but I wonder if it's light, sunlight.
There have been studies that show that both the amount of light, the length of the day and night, and the temperature affect the cold weather adaptation of the animals. So how much of each is often still a question of research work for the scientists, but both of those have an effect. Probably the temperature has a stronger effect because if the temperature gets down particularly close to freezing, that starts having a big effect on the animals. But both the length of the daytime and the temperature has an effect on the cold-blooded animals.
Did I hear you mention earlier a word that started with a T, torpor?
Torpor. Torpor simply means that the animal slowed down. And it usually refers to, less activity, probably lower body temperature. And torpor can apply to both hibernating animals and brumating animals.
Okay. So doesn't freezing kill an animal?
Well, depends what kind of an animal. You, me, yes, freezing would kill us. But remember this gall fly I talked about a little bit ago? These guys can freeze down to minus 55 degrees C if you're way up in Canada where it gets that cold. Thaw out in the spring and keep on going. Before we talk about specific animals, let me talk about how the freezing process injures and kills animals. All animal tissues are made up of little cells. And these cells are microscopic. You can't see them except with a microscope. But if you think about something the size of a bacteria or an amoeba or some other microorganism that you may have heard of, that's what we're talking about. Now I've got something here that I'm going to show you, and there are a couple of close-up pictures that the cameraman will have a chance to show you as well. This is just a little plastic storage container that I have with a screw-on lid. Now I'm going to use this to represent a cell. Now, in preparation for this program, I took a couple of these cells a week or so ago, and I filled them up with water, and then I put a couple little beads in there. You can see the beads here. I'm going to get these out in just a minute and let you see what's going on here. But those beads are in there for two reasons. One, so that you can actually see something besides a clear plastic container full of water isn't very photogenic. But those beads also, in a way, kind of represent the nucleus of the cell. I put these, here, you can have the bear.
All right.
I'm going to bring this over a little bit closer and give the cameraman a fit here. Now, notice here that, these were the same, but this one is bulged up. The top of it's tilted up there. And I set this out about 2 hours ago to let it start to thaw out. And so you can see here, there's water dripping out of there. But I also want to show you that that lid had come loose and there's a crack in there. Can you see that crack in the camera? Okay. The whole top of this lid split. Why did that happen? Because water is one of the few substances that when it goes from liquid form to solid form, it expands. So ice, for a given weight or mass of water, ice takes more space than the same amount of liquid water. Almost all other materials, like steel, things like that, when they solidify, they get smaller than the liquid. But because it expands, that's why ice cubes float. But what happens is that expansion cracks, in this case, the cell membrane. Now, cell membranes are more flexible than this plastic. You think more like the skin of a grape, maybe. But that swelled up, it cracked this hard plastic, and all of our liquid poured out. All of the chemistry of life happens in liquids. In solids, the things can't move around and react with each other. So what happens and there's even some cracks in this, I think, not real obvious ones, okay. But what happens here is the cell freezes, and then when it thaws out, all the liquids inside the cell run out there, and without those liquids, the cell can't function. It can't do its chemical things to convert energy into muscular contraction or whatever, and the cell dies. Now, cells die all the time. We've got billions and billions of cells in our bodies, but they die one at a time and they get replaced. If a whole bunch of cells die at the same time, like when the animal thaws out, then the animal's going to die. So, here's another one that, yep, see it. These are watertight when I put the water in there. They didn't leak like that. This one I don't think cracked as much, but it did push the thing up enough to the point where the lid came off of there. So this is how cells die and why animals can't survive freezing, except that some of them can. I said this guy can get down to minus 55 degrees C. Water freezes at 0 degrees C. We talk about degrees C because scientists always use the metric system. But, so how does this insect get to minus 55 degrees C and not explode like this and die? Well, there's two things that can happen. One is, if he's not going to get real cold, there's something called supercooling, where a cell or a liquid, supercooling applies to liquids, the liquid can get below the freezing point, usually by just a few degrees, without freezing. But what happens is, let's say this got down to minus 3 degrees below freezing, minus 3 Celsius, and it hadn't frozen. And then you bumped it a little bit. Or an ice crystal came up and touched that cell membrane. Almost instantly, that whole thing could crystallize. One big chunk of ice, and it would probably crack, rupture the cell membranes. So supercooling works okay, provided you don't give the ice a chance to get started, because once that crystal starts growing, away it goes. So there are animals that will do that, particularly animals that are in situations where they only are going to get a couple degrees below freezing. But there are a lot of interesting animals that can freeze and survive. I've mentioned the gallfly here, but let's talk about a couple of others. One of our ambassadors here at the Nature Center, if I can get the lid off, this is our box turtle, and these guys live out in the forest. This is the only terrestrial turtle we have in this area, and you know what happened to Humpty Dumpty when he fell off the wall? Well, this turtle thinks the same thing would happen to him, so he doesn't like being up in the air very much. So I'm going to put him down here on the ground, on the table. We're going to make sure he doesn't crawl off the table and get himself hurt, but he doesn't like being held very much. But these guys can actually freeze and thaw out. Now this turtle, we believe, is 30-some years old. Once they get to that age, you can't tell anymore because the scales no longer add rings on there, and they don't get much bigger. So he could be a good bit older than that. They may live to be 50 or 100 years. But I was part of, I kind of assisted some of the zoologists at Miami University when they were studying these to find out where they went and what they did over the winter. What they did was they said, let's track these guys and see where they go in the wintertime. Now, you know, if you're tracking a bird, you put a band on its leg and hope somebody catches the bird and tells you where the band was found. Well, these turtles don't go very far, but they didn't know where they actually went in the wintertime. So they took a little radio transmitter. It was a little bit smaller than this, but this is a good example, about this size, and we glued them onto the back of the turtle's shell like this. So he probably thought he had a turbo boost there or something, but they glued that on the back of the shell, and this little transmitter would send out a little pulse, maybe every 15 or 20 seconds or once a minute or something like that. And then they would use a direction finding antenna and a receiver to track him down. So I built the direction finding antennas for them. Now, this is what it looks like. This is not actually a functional antenna, but we don't have a functional radio transmitter either, so we didn't need a functional antenna, but it looks like this. A loop antenna like this, as I turn it slowly, you can see it's just a loop of wire there. The loop picks up the strongest signal in the direction perpendicular to the plane of the loop. You can see I painted an arrow on the top of my box there to show that. So the strongest signal's in this direction. So if that turtle had a transmitter on it, I'd get a strong signal this way. And then if I took this thing and walked back here someplace, then I would get an alignment that pointed in this direction, and I could draw on those lines on a map, and where the two lines crossed is where the turtle likely is. It's a little more complicated than that because the angle isn't real precise on these things, so sometimes you have to use 3 or 4 sightings of the thing, but then you track him down, and fortunately they don't move very fast and they don't go very far, so you find out where he went. And let's put him back in the box here, because this is just about, we can kind of show what happens. This kind of looks like, you know, this is just leaves from the woods out here. He would go out there and he would dig himself down in till he was just about covered up. Maybe sometimes even the top of his shell might be sticking out, or just below the surface. That's all the deeper that they go in the wintertime. So he is just about covered up with that leaf litter or loose soil, and he's got pretty sharp claws, so he can dig down into the soil a little bit. But at that point, anybody that's gone out and done any digging in the wintertime knows that the ground freezes. So this guy freezes. Now, he doesn't
explode.
It doesn't explode and die every winter. So how does he make that work? Well, he uses what the scientists call cryoprotectant. Cryo means cold temperatures, and protectant obviously is something that protects it. We can think of it as antifreeze. It doesn't actually completely prevent the freezing. It does two things. One is it reduces the tendency to freeze so the temperatures can get a little bit colder before they freeze, but this far down in the ground, the temperature can still get pretty cold. So this cryoprotectant also sucks some of the water out of these little cells, and if we only had this half full or 3/4 full when we froze it, the ice would expand, but it wouldn't get far enough, it wouldn't get to be large enough to fracture or rupture the cell membranes. So by reducing the amount of water inside the cells, when it does freeze, it still expands, but not so much as to cause the rupture. The other thing can happen is by pulling the moisture out, this freezing that happens outside the cells tends to compress the cells instead of expand them. And so both of those things together help protect the animals. So they've found that these guys can freeze up to about 2/3 of the water that's in their bodies can turn into ice. And it's kind of complicated to make that measurement, but they do it. And so I feel real pleased that I was able to contribute to the studies that proved that this is one of the animals that can freeze and survive. The professors that did that work were Dennis Clausen and Richard Lee and their research associate John Costanzo. They were the biologists that did the real research, but I made the antenna for them. And did some other things along with them, but most of the work was theirs. It wasn't mine, but still it's kind of interesting to say, hey, I was part of the people, the team that did this. This animal also has a record, and unless something's been discovered recently that I'm not aware of, this is the largest animal that's known to freeze and survive it. Most of the animals are much smaller insects. Wood frogs, which are small frogs, can freeze. Garter snakes can freeze. They're longer, but they're not as heavy as this. But this is the largest animal that's known to freeze and survive.
It is pretty big.
Yeah.
Actually, to be a frozen ice chunk.
Yeah. I guess you could call it a tortoise-sickle, huh?
Yeah. It's a terrapin.
That's right. It's not a tortoise.
If you want to get technical,
yes.
It's a terrapin, which means a turtle that lives in the forest, basically. So.
Yeah, we don't have any tortoises here.
Right. What other animals can freeze? That's very interesting. I have found a frozen frog. I think it was a wood frog out in the forest before, and so that was.
The wood frogs will freeze, and when they thaw out in the spring and keep on going. So, in fact, some of the wood frogs, when you hear them calling early in the springtime, they may have just unfrozen, just thawed out, within minutes or hours before they start calling. They get very, very active very quickly after that. Well, as for, there's at least one other really interesting animal that everybody knows about that freezes. But this is the woolly worm caterpillar. And everybody's seen woolly worm caterpillars. They crawl all over the place in the late summer and fall, and they have dark bands on the end and lighter colored bands in the middle.
Well, they tell us how cold the winter's going to be, right?
Well, that's what everybody says. Some people say, though, that you can tell by which way they're walking when they cross the road, if they're going north or south. But this summer I saw them all going east and west. So, again, the same scientists at Miami University have studied these animals and the gallflies and the wood frogs. They've studied all of these things. They are actually among the world's experts in freeze-tolerant animals. But they're all retired now, so I'm not sure who the expert is today. But these insects spend a good bit of their life as caterpillars. They overwinter as caterpillars and freeze solid. Again, they use these same kind of cryoprotectant strategies. When this animal grows up, it becomes a tiger moth. But the tiger moth, you may not see these very often because I think they only live a few days. lay their eggs and then they die. A lot of moths have very short lives, but the caterpillar spends a long time out there. The pictures of the caterpillars and the pictures of the gallflies came from the Wikipedia articles on these. So if anybody wants to look up those kinds of things, there is information on Wikipedia. Now things like these scientific studies, they're out there, but you often have to have subscriptions to the scientific things. Actually, some of these are available through links on Miami University's website. You have to dig down and look for them, but they are there. So if you want to study up on how freeze tolerance in the terrestrial turtle, Terrapene carolina, which is this one, the paper's out there. Now, Erin read the paper, and I've read the paper, but some of you may not.
It's very interesting information, and it also gives us something to look for when we're out there, and it actually gives me inspiration of waiting for change that happens, like if you're waiting for a job change or whatever lifestyle, like when the turtle freezes, and then that it's gonna be okay. And yesterday in my CPR class, I learned that if someone drowns or goes underwater, and if they're cold, they can survive longer.
That's right. It's called the diving seal reflex.
Is it because of the cells?
It's not a deal with freezing, because we're not talking about freezing here. But in a seal, which of course is a warm-blooded animal that lives in cold water, when they dive down, their body temperature can be suppressed so that they can use a little bit less energy. It turns out that when people drown in cold water, that their body temperature can be cooled very quickly, especially if some of the water gets into their lungs or into their throat and cools their internal organs very quickly, especially their heart, which is right next to the lungs and the stomach. That cooling reduces the energy requirements for the heart, and of course if the brain gets cooled, it reduces the brain uses a lot of energy also. So by reducing the amount of energy requirements, the tissues survive longer. So a cold water drowning, people can survive much longer than something causes their heart to stop when everything's warm.
Interesting. Very, very, very interesting. So there's hope in the winter, guys. There's hope in the cold. That's great information. Thank you, Lynn, for sharing the project that you did. And so you created this transmitter.
Well, I didn't create the transmitter. They bought the transmitters, but I built the direction finding antenna for them.
That's so neat to be part of a study like that. And for sharing this information with me. And anything else?
Well, Erin, I want to thank you for inviting me to do this, because I enjoy sharing what I've learned with other people. And I guess the final point is that people sometimes ask me, well, what's your favorite season of the year? And I say, what day is today? And what's the calendar say? Well, this is the best time, because there's never a bad season to be outdoors. So get your compass and get your warm clothes on and go for a hike.
That's right. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for
Erin.
being on today's show. So that's it for today's show. If you have any more questions, you can check us out online at ohiostateparks.gov, or you can stop by the Nature Center, and we'll see you on the trails.